Upon the platform of the pyramid, the Spaniards had built a little chapel dedicated to the Virgin de los Remedios. Here, an ecclesiastic of the Indian blood celebrated every day, Mass every day. Crowds came from far and near to witness the festival, and among them were so many of the descendants of the ancient peoples to whom the land had once belonged. What thoughts must have crowded upon them as they stood there, silent and degraded, the last of the race. Glory to Quetzalcoatl no longer rent to the air. It was a drowsy with the blessed mutter of the Mass, and good, strong, thick, stupefying incense smoke. Quetzalcoatl had passed away, but his altar still remained. A mysterious dread, a religious awe pervaded their souls as they gazed upon that immense pile covered with shrubbery and perpetual verdure. The pyramid of Cholula, having led with the travelers a little beyond Iztaccíhuatl and Popocatépetl, they turned back and visited these volcanoes. Before proceeding the Zapala, Humboldt determined their geographical position by his observations and measured their height. Iztaccíhuatl he found to be 15,700 feet above the sea, and Popocatépetl 17,700, which was 2,000 feet higher than the most elevated summit of the old world. He ascended to the summit of the latter mountain. It was an ever-burning volcano, but for several centuries it had thrown up nothing but its crater, in but smoke and ashes. Speaking of a report that prevailed in Mexico that Diego Ordaz penetrated into the crater of Popocatépetl for the purpose of procuring sulfur for the Spaniards to make powder with, Humboldt gossips thus about the circumstance and the mountain itself. When the united army of the Spaniards and Sulcatls in the month of October 1519 marched from Cholula to Tenochtitlan across the Cordillera of Ajuculco, which unites the Sierra Nevada to the volcanic summit of Popocatépetl. The army suffered both from the cold and the extreme impetuosity of the winds which constantly prevail on the tableland. Writing of his march to the emperor, Cortez expresses himself in the following manner: seeing smoke issue from a very elevated mountain and wishing to make to your royal excellency a minute report of whatever this country contains of the wonderful. I chose from among my companions in arms 10 of the most courageous, and I ordered them to ascend to the summit and discover the secret of the smoke, and to tell me whence and where it issued. Bernal Diaz affirms that Diego Ordaz was of that expedition, and that this captain attained to the very brink of the crater. He may have happened to boast of it afterwards, for it related to by other historians that the emperor gave him permission to place the volcano on his arms. That the Lopez de Guamara, who composed his history from the accounts of the conquistadors and religious missionaries, does not name Ordaz as the chief of the expedition, but he vaguely asserts that 2 Spaniards measured with the eye the size of the crater. Cortez, however, expressly says that his people ascended very high, that they saw much smoke issue out, but that none of them could reach the volcano on account of the enormous quantity of smoke from which it covered. The rigor of the cold and the clouds of ashes that enveloped the travelers A terrible noise which they heard on approaching the summit determined them to turn immediately towards back. You see from the account of Cortez that the expedition of Ordaz had no view of extracting sulfur from the volcano, and that neither he nor his companions saw the crater in 1519. They brought back, says Cortez, only snow and pieces of ice, the appearance of which astonished us very much, because this country is under 20 degrees of latitude, and according to the parallel of the island, Espanola, and consequently, according to the opinion of the pilots, ought to be very warm. 3 years later, however, after 2 unsuccessful attempts, the Spaniards succeeded in seeing the crater of Popocatépetl. It seemed to them 3/4 of a league in circumference, and they found on the brink of the precipice a small quantity of sulfur, which had been deposited there by the vapors. Cortez relates that he is of no want of sulfur, the manufacture of powder, because the Spaniard drew from a mountain which perpetually smokes by descending tied to a rope to the depths of 70 or 80 fathoms. A document preserved in the family of the Monteros, and which Cardinal Lorenza affirms he once had in his hands, proof that the Spaniards of whom Cortez speaks was Francisco Montano. Did that intrepid man really enter into the crater of Popocatépetl, or did he extract the sulfur, as several persons on the volcano supposes, from a lateral crevice of the volcano? M. Alzante, with very little foundation, affirms that Diego Ordaz extracted sulfur from the crater of the old volcano of Tuilacati, to the east of the lake of Chalo, near the Indian village of Tuilano. The makers of contraband powder no doubt procure sulfur there, but Cortez expressly designates Popocatépetl by the phrase, the mountain which constantly smokes. By this as it may, it is certain that after the rebuilding of the city of Tenochtitlan, the soldiers of the army of Cortez ascended the summit of Popocatépetl, where nobody has since been. From the volcanoes of Iztacatl and Popocatépetl, the travelers procured seated to Xalapa, traveling for the most part over lofty mountains and through dense forests of oaks and firs. They lodged while at Xalapa in the convent of Saint Francis, the view from which was magnificent. On one hand, they could see the plains and the ocean, and on the other, the acclivities of the Cordilleras and the Anahuac, and the colossal summits of Orizaba, and the Cofre of Perot. The Cofre of Perot was a rock of singular shape on the eastern side of the summit of the prolific mountains of that same name. It resembled a square tower, and reserved as a signal to the sailors who put it in at Veracruz, the harbor of Veracruz, and the castles San Juan de Luna were visible from this great watchtower. Nothing at the summit announced a crater, yet the mountains had enveloped in a thick bed of pumicestone. Its height was 13,500 feet. The peak of Orizaba, which Humboldt ascended, and which he always regarded as the most magnificent mountain in the world, was 200 or 300 feet higher than the crater of Popocatépetl. The indecency of Veracruz, like that of Puebla, was celebrated for its ruins. The most remarkable of these was the pyramid of Papalantla. It was situated in the midst of a thick forest at the distance of 2 leagues from a great Indian village. It was unknown to the Spaniards for centuries, for as it was an object of veneration among the Indians, they concealed its existence from the conquerors of the country, and it was only discovered accidentally by some hunters about 30 years before the time of Humboldt's visit. It was not constructed of bricks or clay mixed with stone, and the faced with a wall like the pyramids of Cholula and Tenochtitlan. The only materials employed were immense stones of polyrifical shape. Mortar was distinguishable in the seams. The edifice, however, was not so remarkable for its size as for its symmetry. The polish of the stones and the great regularity of their cut. The base of the pyramid was an exact square, each side breaking 82 feet in length. Their perpendicular height appeared not to be more than 50 to 60 feet. This monument, like all the Mexican temples, was composed of several terraces. 6 were still distinguishable, and a 7th appeared to be concealed by the vegetation, with which the sides of the pyramid were covered. A great stair of 57 steps connected to the truncated top of the pyramid, where the human victims were sacrificed. On each side of the great stair was a small stair. The facing of the terraces was adorned with hieroglyphics, in which serpents and crocodiles carved in relief were discernible. Each terrace contained a great number of square niches symmetrically distributed. In the first story were 24 on each side, and the second 20, and in the third 16. The numbers of these niches in the body of the pyramid was 366. And there were 12 in the stair towards the east. The Abbe Marquez supposed that this number of 378 niches had some allusion to a calendar of the Mexicans, and he believed that in each of them one of the 20 figures was repeated, which in the hieroglyphical language of the Toltec served as a symbol for marking the days of the common year and the intricated days at the end of cycles. The route from Zapala to Perot was thrice traveled over by Humboldt and Bonpland, and each time subjected to barometric measurements for the purpose of a post road, which was afterwards constructed in the locality according to the Humboldt's plans. The remainder of their stay in the New World was destitute of incident, and may be summed up briefly. From Zapala, they proceeded to Veracruz, where the yellow fever was raging. They stopped here a few days after when a Spanish frigate sailing from Havana. They took passage in her, quitting the shores of Mexico on the 7th of March. They remained at Havana 2 months, attending to the packing and shipping of their various collections, and set sail for the Philadelphia, which they reached after a stormy passage of 32 days. While in Philadelphia at a public library, Humboldt received intelligence which delighted him. It was in a scientific publication, and to this effect, arrival of M.D. Humboldt's manuscripts at his brother's house in Paris by way of Spain. He could hardly help shouting for joy. From Philadelphia, they proceeded to Washington, where Humboldt was introduced to Jefferson. They left the New World on the 9th of June, 1804.